final lesson in our series on the history of the Bible. In last week's lesson, we surveyed the history of the English Bible translation from the Old English period through the Middle English and into the early Modern English period. In this lesson, we will complete our study with a survey of the modern English versions of the Bible from the King James all the way up to the present day. The story of the modern English Bible is largely the story of the Tyndale tradition. For nearly 500 years, an extended family of English Bibles has descended from the diligent work of William Tyndale and his associates. Now, even with the prodigious production of newer, independent translations in the 20th and 21st centuries, only one, the New International Version, has been able to mount anything close to a serious challenge to the Tyndale family of translations for favor among the Bible reading public. As this chart illustrates, less than 100 years after the publication of Tyndale's first edition of his New Testament, the Tyndale family tree spawned its most famous child, and that was the King James Version of 1611. The King James Version arose out of a desire to produce an authorized translation acceptable to all elements of English Christianity, Catholic, Anglican, and Puritan. King James I of England, who was formerly known as James VI of Scotland, acceded to the throne upon the death of Elizabeth I, and he saw a new translation of the Bible as an opportunity to act as a peacemaker in his newly acquired realm. It also afforded the opportunity of replacing the two most popular versions that were then in circulation. That would be the Bishop's Bible and the Geneva Bible. Following the precedent set by the Geneva Bible, the new translation was assigned to a committee of scholars working under specific guidelines. The King James was based on the Bishop's Bible, but the readings of the versions of Tyndale, Matthew, Coverdale, the Great Bible, and even the Geneva Bible were authorized for use where they agreed more closely with the original text. Most important, perhaps, no marginal notes were included except where they're absolutely necessary for explaining certain Hebrew or Greek words. The new translation would not be the property or the pet translation of any sect of Christianity in England. King James Version was also commonly called the Authorized Version, but actually, in the technical sense, is neither a version nor authorized. Despite the printer's claim on the title page, it was not a new translation from the original language. It was a revision of its immediate predecessors, as the original preface makes clear. There's no evidence that it was ever formally authorized for exclusive use in English churches. The printer's claim to that effect on the title page was a clause carried over from earlier translations like the Great Bible. The King James Version was actually a third authorized Bible, rather than the authorized version. The text of the King James Version was based on few, if any, of the superior textual manuscripts discovered from the 12th to the 15th centuries. Rather, it followed a Greek text compiled and published in 1516 by a scholar named Desiderius Erasmus. Erasmus's text was the first Greek New Testament text to be produced in print form. His text, which came to be called the Textus Receptus, which is Latin for the received text, was based on 6 late Greek minuscule manuscripts, so it did not have the greatest of textual pedigrees. Erasmus's text contained all of the typical characteristics of translations based on these late manuscripts. It included the long ending of Mark. It included the story in John 7:53 through 8:11 about the woman caught in adultery, which is not found in the best early manuscripts. And it includes the 3 witnesses in heaven text of 1 John 5 and 7, as you find it in the King James. This is almost certainly an insertion by a later scribe, because this verse provides book, chapter, and verse for the support of the doctrine of the Trinity. Now, that's not to say that the doctrine of the Trinity is not in the New Testament. It is. But it is there through interpretation of other verses. And in the early centuries of the church, Orthodox scholars were searching heaven and earth for one silver bullet verse that would prove the veracity of the doctrine of the Trinity. And they just couldn't find it. If 1 John 5 and 7 had been in these early manuscripts, they would have certainly have cited that in their writings, but it just wasn't there. So at some place along the way, some well-meaning scribe inserted this verse in 1 John 5. The three witnesses in heaven as opposed to the three witnesses on earth who are supposed to be in agreement. That verse is simply not in the earliest and best manuscripts, but it is in the Textus Receptus, and so it came to be in the King James Version. Many of the old ecclesiastical words and Latinisms that had been eliminated by Tyndale and his successors were reintroduced into the King James Version. This probably reflects the influence of the recently published Reims Catholic New Testament, and also reflects a desire to win over the Catholic readership for the King James Version. The publishers contributed to the success of the King James by ceasing publication of the Bishop's Bible in 1606 and by issuing the King James Version in the same format as the Geneva Bible, that is, in dividing the text into chapters and verses. In 1701, a dating system devised by Archbishop James Ussher was inserted into the margins of the King James, where it has remained ever since. And over time, the spelling of the earlier editions of the King James was modified and modernized. But other than that, only minor revisions of the King James Version were ever undertaken before the late 19th century. After the publication of the King James Bible, the tidal wave of English translations came to a halt for 270 years. However, by the second half of the 19th century, a number of forces were marshaling to make a major revision of the venerable King James Version inevitable. First, there were changes in the way the English language was spoken over a period of nearly 300 years. In addition to that, dialectic and idiomatic peculiarities arose between English speakers in the various parts of the world where the British Empire had expanded. And also, the advancement of textual scholarship and the discovery of the great ancient manuscripts by Tischendorf and others demanded an update of the King James Version. And suddenly, the dormant family tree of the Tyndale tradition of Bible translations became active again, and remains so today, as our chart shows. All of the forthcoming translations were actually first, second, and even third generation revisions of the 1611 King James Bible. Even beyond that, they all share in the heritage of the Tyndale tradition of English Bible translations. And we're going to take a brief look at each of them. In 1870, a convocation of the Church of England called for a revision of the King James Version where the Hebrew and Greek texts had been inaccurately or wrongly translated. The actual process of revision was begun in 1871. And in 1872, a group of American scholars was asked to join the work. The initial revision took 6 years, and it took another 2.5 years to consider the suggestions of the American Committee. The New Testament of the English Revised Version was published in paragraph form on May 17, 1881, with the Old Testament following in 1885. The Apocrypha was completed in 1896, and finally the entire Bible of the English Revised Version was published in one volume in 1898. Now, the response to the English Revised Version was generally disappointing, and it would take several generations for the altered words and rhythms to be popularly accepted. Now, although some of the readings of the English Revised Version were not completely favored by the American Committee, they agreed not to publish an American edition for 14 years after the release of the English version. But then in 1901, the American Standard Edition of the Revised Version, or more simply, the American Standard Version, was published. The ASV replaced some antiquated terms with more modern ones. For instance, the ASV uses the word Jehovah instead of Lord in places where the untranslatable proper name of God appears in the text. Also, the American Standard uses the term Holy Spirit instead of Holy Ghost. And these are just a couple examples of differences between the American and British versions of this revision. The American Standard Translation is very literal. Some think it's too literal because no one ever really spoke English in the way that it's rendered in the ASV. Nevertheless, the version slowly won its way into American churches, and copies were even imported into England because many British readers actually favored the Americanisms of the American Standard Version. And although the ASV lacks the aesthetic beauty of the King James, its more accurate readings made it acceptable for teachers and students alike. And this was actually the authorized version during my college days at Lubbock Christian University. Only 50 years after the publication of the English Revised Version, the need for another revision was already apparent. The 1881 Westcott and Hort edition of the Greek New Testament, which was the basis of the English Revised and the American Standard versions, had been significantly modified in light of the emergence of even more ancient manuscripts, including the discovery of several papyrus collections. And in addition, the literary style and taste of the English language had continued to change. So in 1937, the International Council of Religious Education authorized a committee to proceed with a revision to take advantage of the advancements of scholarship while still preserving the qualities of the King James Version that had secured for it a supreme place in English literature. The project was delayed by World War II, but the New Testament was finally published in 1946 as the Revised Standard Version. The Old Testament followed in 1952, and a second edition of the complete Revised Standard Bible was published in 1971. The RSV uses simpler and more current forms of pronouns such as you and yours instead of thee and thou, except when those pronouns are used in reference to God. Now, whereas the American Standard was charged with over-literalization of the text, the RSV was criticized for going to the opposite extreme. The most notorious example is the substitution of the words young woman for the traditional virgin in Isaiah 7 and 14. The Revised Standard Version of that verse says, "Behold, a young woman shall conceive and bear a son, and you shall call his name Emmanuel." Now, for all of the trouble that it caused, the RSV is really a more accurate translation of the original Hebrew word alma. The word virgin in the King James and other English translations is based on the Greek word parthenos, as it appears in the Septuagint translation. And as British biblical scholar F.F. Bruce has noted, the criticism attending the publication of the Revised Standard Version was remarkably reminiscent of that voiced in earlier centuries by Jews against the Septuagint and by Christians against the Latin Vulgate, the versions of Martin Luther and William Tyndale, and even the reactions against the King James Version when it first came out. It seems that resistance to change, even when it's beneficial, is pretty much universal to all mankind. But all criticisms aside, the Revised Standard Version provided the English-speaking world with an up-to-date revision of the scriptures based on the best Greek and Hebrew texts that textual scholars could provide. Furthermore, the Revised Standard Version opened the era of the multiple translations that flood today's market. All of them are competing with each other for the loyalty of the English-speaking reader. The New American Standard Bible is an original translation from the original languages, but it is based on the same principles of translation as the American Standard Version of 1901. The New Testament of the New American Standard Bible was first published in 1963. The complete Bible came out in 1971. The most recent edition available to us today was published in 1995 after a revision. The New American Standard offered an alternative to the Revised Standard Version, which was considered by some to be theologically liberal. For example, in Isaiah 7 and 14, the New American Standard Bible reads virgin, even though that is really not the most accurate translation of the Hebrew. The New American Standard includes the long ending of Mark. It includes John 7:53 to 11, although both of those passages are enclosed in brackets to acknowledge the textual problems that are associated with them. The three witnesses in heaven text of 1 John 5 and 7 that we discussed a minute ago is omitted from the main body of the text in the New American Standard Version, but it is referenced in a footnote. The New American Standard Bible is considered by some to be the most literal of all the major 20th century English Bible translations. And by the way, this is the translation that I usually study and teach from. In 1982, we see the publication of the New King James Version. The aim of its translators was to update the vocabulary and the grammar of the King James while preserving the classic style and literary beauty of the original 1611 version. The 130 translators believed in the faithfulness to the Old Testament Greek and Aramaic and Hebrew texts and included the Dead Sea Scrolls in their translation process. The New Testament of the New King James Version is based on the Textus Receptus that was used for the original King James, as opposed to the modern critical text that underlies most of the latest English translations. However, notes in the center column acknowledge variations from the more recent critical text. So the New King James tries to preserve the traditional beauty and cadence of the King James, but it does acknowledge that some of its translations may be dated and perhaps made obsolete by discoveries of older and better manuscripts. The New Revised Standard Version, published in 1989, is a thorough revision intended to replace the old 1952 RSV and to secure it a place alongside the many other English language translations that are available today. It eliminated the familiar but archaic second-person pronoun forms, the these and thous, of the Revised Standard Version, even in those cases where it is God who's being addressed. The Translation Committee for the New Revised Standard Version adopted a unique new policy of gender-neutral language. The old RSV had observed the older convention of using masculine nouns even in a gender-neutral sense. For instance, translating man instead of person, where that would have fit just as well or perhaps even better. In some cases, the old RSV used a masculine word where the original source language used a neuter word. But the mandates for the New Revised Standard Version specified that in references to men and women, masculine-oriented language should be eliminated as far as it could be done without altering passages that reflect the historical situation of ancient patriarchal culture. One of the conventions that the NRSV uses is to expand gender-specific phrases. For example, if a translation used the word brothers to refer to a group that is known not to be all male, the NRSV may use the terms brothers and sisters, noting such adjustments by printing the more literal translation in a footnote. After the New Revised Standard, the English Standard Version was published in 2001, and this is a revision of the 1971 revision of the 1952 Revised Standard Version. The stated intent of the translators of this version was to follow an essentially literal translation while taking into account differences of grammar, syntax, and idiom between current literary English and the original languages. The ESV also uses some gender-neutral language. The Translation Committee continues to make frequent revisions of the English Standard Version to reflect textual discoveries or changes in English over passing of time. Now, besides the English translations in the Tyndale tradition, there are many, many independent translations of the Bible, or at least of the New Testament, that are called modern speech translations. Numerous private translations were published by Protestant scholars during the early part of the 20th century, as is shown on this chart. But our focus in this section will be on translations that were produced in the traditional method by traditional publishing houses. In 1946, the General Assembly of the Church of Scotland, who was concerned that the newly published Revised Standard Version was not an adequate continuation of earlier English versions, met to consider a completely new translation. The aim of the committee was a translation done in timeless English, avoiding both archaisms and transient modernisms. They sought for their translation a general recognition as an authoritative second version to stand alongside the King James for public and private reading. The New Testament of the New English Bible was published in 1961. The complete Bible, including the Apocrypha, and a second edition of the New Testament was published in 1970. The New English Bible was the first non-private English translation to make a clean break with the King James Version. The basic text for the Old Testament is the Masoretic text, with some conjectural emendations and editorial changes, and there's a heavier reliance on the Dead Sea Scrolls in the New English Bible than in any previous English version. The New English features more than 400 changes in the New Testament and has brought some of its readings into harmony with the renderings of its Old Testament translation. In other words, Old Testament quotations in the New Testament are made to reflect more closely to the original wording of their Old Testament passages. The New English Bible has not gained as much favor in the United States as it has in Britain. Its Anglicisms just sound really strange to the American ear. For instance, in Matthew 26, verse 47, it is said that those that were sent to arrest Jesus were armed with cudgels instead of staves, as in the King James Version, or clubs, as in the Revised Standard. And in Matthew 5 and 15, the New English Bible has Jesus saying that men do not light a lamp and then hide it under a meal tub instead of the more common bushel that we read in other English versions. Critics have also pointed out that the frequent rearrangement of verses, which we find in the New English Bible, has no basis in the original text. There are over 100 textual displacements in the Old Testament alone, with no real textual reason for doing so. So that has been one of the major criticisms of the New English Bible. By far, the most popular of the modern English translations is the New International Version. This translation was the culmination of a process that began in the 1950s. The New Testament of the NIV was published in 1973, and then the complete Bible came out in 1978. More than 100 scholars from various English-speaking countries were engaged in the NIV project. One of those was Dr. Jack Lewis from our own fellowship, from whom I took this course when I was in graduate school. After those 100 scholars had done their work, a 15-member general committee made the final editorial decisions. The New International Version is a completely new translation. It's not a revision of any previous version. The Old Testament follows the Masoretic text, although some readings are taken from the Dead Sea Scrolls or the Septuagint or the Syriac or Vulgate versions. According to the preface, the Greek text underlying the NIV is an eclectic one. In other words, they kind of cherry-picked readings from various Greek manuscripts. In general, the NIV follows the modern critical Greek text, but not always. And sometimes the NIV is inconsistent in the way it renders ambiguous passages in the Greek text, and that has resulted in some awkward expressions. The NIV also follows the current practice of using modern pronouns even when addressing deity. However, the tradition of setting in italics words not found in the Hebrew and Greek texts has not been followed in the New International Version. So, there are some of the pluses and minuses of the NIV as they have been identified by scholars. But it is a most popular translation, even now, nearly 50 years after its first publication. And it is a very serviceable, a very good translation for its purposes. In the early 1980s, the World Bible Translation Center in Fort Worth published a new translation that employed a limited and simplified vocabulary to meet the special needs of the deaf reader. And this translation was titled, appropriately enough, the English Version for the Deaf. Now, the surprise here was that simplified text also proved to be popular with readers for whom English is a second language, and also for those whose reading ability in English is below average. Therefore, the same text has variously been published since then as the New Century Version, the Everyday Bible, and the Easy to Read Bible. And a special revision of that text has been published as the International Children's Bible. Despite its elementary reading level, the text of the World Bible Translation Center is a legitimate and original version. The basis of the Old Testament translation is the critical text of the United Bible Society. The Old Testament is based on the Masoretic text with some references to the Septuagint. Now, the World Bible Translation Center doesn't exist anymore. They have been sold and that company resold 3 or 4 times. But the translation is still available and is published today by Thomas Nelson Publishing Company, and it is titled the New Century Version. In 1989, an update of the New English Bible of 1970 was published, jointly by Oxford and Cambridge universities. And this revision is called the Revised English Bible. The Revised English is a result of both advances in scholarship and translation made since the 1960s, and also a desire to correct what have been seen as some of the New English Bible's more notable deficiencies. Many of the most idiosyncratic renderings of the New English Bible were changed, moving the Revised English Bible more in the direction of the standard translation, such as the New International. The Revised English Bible is intended to be gender inclusive to the extent that it is justified by the original language. But it doesn't take as much liberty and take this to the same extent as other versions have done. And like the New English Bible, the Revised English Bible is primarily presented to British and British educated public, although it does have some American users and admirers. Then at the turn of the 21st century, the Committee on Bible Translation, which were the developers of the New International Version in the 70s, came out with a new edition called Today's New International Bible. It's based on the NIV. The New Testament was published in 2002, and the Complete Bible in 2005. Among the differences between the NIV and the TNIV, the most striking would probably be, again, the use of gender-neutral language when referring to generic groups of people. And at this point, we're going to bring this study to a close. It's not to say that the study is complete, because the English Bible remains in a constant state of revision and development. And as long as English remains a living language, and as long as English-speaking people continue to read the Bible, the English Bible will need to be continuously groomed and tweaked to ensure that its timeless message is meaningfully communicated to its ever-changing readership. We are living in the dawn of a historical age in literary publication that is as world-changing as the invention of the printing press in the 15th century. And that is the age of digital publication. Already, excellent new English translations of the Bible are available in digital format that may never see the light of day in traditional book form. In 1539, single copies of the Great Bible, which was as big as the top of a small lamp table, were chained to the pulpits of English churches to keep people from stealing them. Today, I have more than 50 English Bibles clipped to my belt, stored in digital format on my cell phone. And who can dare to predict what the advancements of the next 50 or 100 or even 500 years will bring? So as this study comes to a close, the subject matter continues to grow and to evolve at breakneck speed. In light of the dizzying array of English language Bibles available to the public today, the question always arises, which of the English translations is the best? And the answer to that question is always that there is no simple answer to that question, because no single translation available today is necessarily ideal for each and every situation. Now, the restraints of time have prevented us from delving into some interesting and important topics in this study related to Bible translation, such as the difference between a formal equivalent translation and a dynamic equivalent translation. In other words, a word-for-word translation and a thought-for-thought translation. And we have not been able to discuss the situations in which one or the other of those might be preferable. Variables involved in the selection of a translation would include whether the translation is being used primarily for public reading, for personal devotion and edification, or for formal academic study. Another variable would be the English proficiency and reading level of the reader or the listening audience. So, the best translation is the one that best meets the needs of the present situation. And thanks be to God that we have so many choices available to us. A closing thought, and hopefully the overarching lesson learned through this entire study, comes to us from the prophet Isaiah, who wrote in chapter 55, beginning in verse 10, "For as the rain and the snow come down from heaven, and do not return there without watering the earth, and making it bear and sprout, and furnishing seed to the sower, and bread to the eater, so will my word be which goes forth from my mouth. It will not return to me empty, without accomplishing what I desire, and without succeeding in the matter for which I sent it." The same God who inspired the prophets and apostles to record his word in written form has superintended the preservation, the transmission, and the translation of that word into the multiple languages of mankind, including our own English language. And for all of their differences and vagaries and idiosyncrasies, the one thing that virtually all English translations share in common is that any man or woman can pick up any one of them, and through careful and purposeful reading, can come into a saving relationship with God through Jesus Christ. And in the final analysis, that's all that really matters. Thank you so much for being a part of this study on the history of our Bible. I hope that you have found it a blessing and beneficial to you. God bless you as you continue to study His Word.